and welcome to our Instagram Live, Becoming a Thinker. And this week, news is we've got a desk, so it feels a little bit like we're actually reading the news.
Just trying out a few different things,
Absolutely.
see what works. Absolutely. So what's this one about? Well, we're talking this time about becoming a thinker. And we're going to explore all that means. But I thought we'd start by just acknowledging that thinking is just part of being human. We do it all day, every day. But of course, what we want to know as parents of very young children is how we can help our children to become accomplished thinkers and readying them really for a society that we know nothing about. Because if we think about our first jobs, I remember I left school at 16 and I started in an IT company. But even though it was an IT company, we had no email and we had no social media, no mobile phones. So the world that our children are going to grow up into, we can't even begin to imagine what that's going to be like. I mean, again, thinking about the business I started 20 years ago, so not even at the beginning of my career. Again, there was no social media. There were mobile phones by then, but nothing like the technology that our children are now exposed to all day, every day. So these less tangible skills, things like thinking, are just critical to the sort of invisible skills that they need to have to face whatever this world's going to be that they grow up into. So we're going to be exploring that.
And the jobs that our children are going to end up doing, some of them are jobs that haven't yet been invented, and that's a bit mind-blowing. So to prepare our children to function well in the society that they're going to grow up in, then we can't kind of say, well, here, learn how to do shorthand typing or learn how to do bookkeeping. What we're really going to focus on is that idea that if you are a creative thinker, if you're a critical thinker, if you've got thinking skills, then you should be able to apply them to whatever comes. So that's why also in my first 5 years we talk a lot about dispositions for learning as well as the knowledge that you learn. So things like being resilient, things like being curious, they're all very much linked to thinking. So it's this idea of how can you support your child to develop as a thinker as well as somebody who can read and write and do maths and all those other things.
So why don't we start with some of the key things that parents can do to help their child become a thinker?
So, thinking starts, there are different sorts of thinking. There's thinking that's subconscious thinking that just happens all the time. So when you are picking up a drink or when you are using a knife and fork, you are thinking about that process. Sometimes thinking is driven by sensation. So you might get a sense of being hungry, called introception. Or you might get a sense of being scared and you want to run away and you've got to think about how you do that and your mind processes what might happen. And then sometimes thinking is a conscious act where you are trying to problem solve and you need to apply your thinking skills. So there are skills linked to thinking. So for babies, as they are developing, a lot of their thinking isn't purposeful. They're not thinking, ooh, there is an object, I want to grasp it and put it in my mouth, because they haven't got that kind of conscious processing, but their normal developmental brain is making them think that because it's part of their development. So a lot of early thinking that babies do is innate in terms of their development. What we can do to support that thinking is provide them with stimulus, so whether that be spaces to be, resources, things like the kind of things that you hang over your baby, things that are in the cot. I'm not talking about flashcards here. I'm talking about resources that are available around the home that inspires or engages their brain to think about doing things. Then as your children begin to get older, you can structure their play and their interactions, even their meal times and bath times, their routines around things that will encourage them to think.
And I think one of the things we sometimes do is maybe limit choices for children, and we think that that's going to help them concentrate a little bit. But you've got some thoughts on that, and I've got some thoughts as well from the days that I ran a nursery. But you start.
Oh, go on then. And also, we say I think all the time because it's an important skill. I think when we are trying to engage children in the process of being a thinker, what we're trying to get them to do is have a vast bank of experiences they've had and thought processes they've gone through that have produced an outcome that they can then rely on. So when they meet a new situation, every situation isn't new. They think, oh, there's elements of this I've met before. I can use some of that previous knowledge. So when we want children to have lots of opportunity to develop different elements of their thinking, the way we can do that is to provide them with lots of opportunities to engage in play, interaction, exploration. So if we've got an activity that's very narrow, so it's basically, we're going to do this, this is how it's going to be, and this is the end result. If everything children do is like that, it very much narrows their thinking. So for example, if you were saying, we've been out for a walk, which is great, we've listened to the birds, you've picked some daffodils, if you're allowed, and then we've brought them back home, but now we're going to paint a daffodil. So I've got some yellow paint and some green paint, and here's a daffodil I painted, let's paint a daffodil for Grandma. And children engage in that very narrow activity, then their thinking is quite restricted. If you said, we've been for a walk, it's all been painted, let's come home and get all the paints out and paint whatever you want and just experiment with different sizes of brushes or your hands, or let's get things out of the cupboard or the drawer and paint with those, let's go outside and collect some resources and paint with that, then suddenly you've got children thinking about a whole range of how do I make this work, how does this feel, how do I get that to go into there, how do I get that to come out of there, and suddenly their thinking is massively extended as opposed to this is what I'm going to do. So sometimes, say for example you're doing a puzzle or a jigsaw, or you're reading a book with flaps, there's that kind of thinking where you are structuring and scaffolding thinking for children, how puzzles fit together, how you do a jigsaw. That's one kind of thinking. But then if you're looking at that kind of more creative thinking, that's around saying, here's some really open-ended experiences or resources. How are you going to interpret those?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more we limit their choices, the more instructional we are, the less that they're thinking. And one of my big lessons, when I first met Alistair, 15 years ago now, I was quite instructional in how I played with the children. So we would have sat there and made a daffodil, and I'd have probably, got some bits of egg boxes, and I'd have probably cut them out, and they'd have stuck things together, and we'd have all ended up with 3 daffodils that looked exactly the same because we were just following instructions. And you really got me laughing about this, about the idea that they weren't being creative. I was thinking the more beautiful that the daffodil they created was, the more creative they were being, when actually I was totally limiting them to just following my instructions. So I changed overnight. When Alistair sort of opened my eyes to this, it was so obvious and real sort of common sense that what we do is give them a blank canvas, whether that be a blank sheet of paper or a blank wall or outside on the pavement, but the more we let them express themselves rather than instructing them how this thing should look at the end, it's sort of been involved in the process where the thinking happens.
It is.
And often there ends up being little or no output, but the process is where the magic has happened.
It is, and I think obviously as adults we have to scaffold some learning for children and model some things, because you've got to expect children to know how to use a paintbrush or how to mix paint or even how to paint a circle. So there's some things that you will model, but it's about giving them that kind of freedom to be able to express and explore and build that bank of things to think about. If you want a creative thinker, then you need to give them opportunities to think creatively. And so how you get to think creatively is when you've got a number of options that you need to explore before you get to an answer. And so the more ambiguous we can be in the opportunities we offer children, then the more opportunity there is for them to be more creative in their thinking.
And a question's coming through about the fact that schools can be really quite instructional, but we are focusing, I guess, on that 0 to 5 space right now for this conversation, and we can't fix the school system necessarily, but we can have impact on our own children's learning. And one of the things I always look for when I say to parents, they say, what should I look for in a good nursery? What should we be looking for when we go for a show round? And I always said, have a look at the displays of the children's work. And if you walk in and you see, the reason we're focusing on daffodils, by the way, today is that outside in this country, there are daffodils blooming absolutely everywhere. So we've done nothing but talk about them all day. But if it's a spring display and literally there's a class of, 24 children and there are 24 daffodils that all look the same, or 24 sheep that all have the same cotton wool and the same tail and the same googly eyes, that hasn't been a creative activity. That has been a set of instructions to create an outcome. And I would even admit in the early days of my nursery, before I really more deeply understood how children learn, that some of the practitioners would even correct what the children had done and sort it out later so that it matched. What they all began to learn as we went on a journey of really sort of valuing children's thinking is that what was a successful display to me was that everything was different. And that meant that the children had been let to express themselves. And it wasn't a daffodils display, it was a spring display. And it might have had anything, whether it be to do with spring or not, everything was celebrated.
I think when we think about thinking, which we are, it's the idea that in that instance, if you make a daffodil with your child and you have a lovely half hour where you sit together and you have a lovely conversation about how you went for a walk, and actually the outcome of that process was actually in terms of interactions, language, personal social development, personal links, it was really positive. It's just the creative aspect, which is probably not as broad as it could be. And, no one died. It was, not a terrible thing to happen to that child. It's not going to damage them. I think what we're saying is there's a huge potential that is lost or not seen in the fact that they aren't given that scope to develop those abilities to think for themselves and be independent. So even the point, if we stick with a creative theme, where I've really worked with from 2-year-olds really successfully with children who will choose their own paint and choose their own pot. And even if you put your paint at home, if you collect any kind of hand soap dispensers or buy the reusable ones and put your paint in that they can just squirt it out themselves, or if you've got powder paint in sugar shakers, things like that, that children can then self-select, and they're going through the thinking process of what size pot do I need, how hard do I need to press, what if I press too hard, if I put too much of one colour, when is the pot full, when is the pot empty, if I drop the pot, why is that? So there's a lot of mess involved in thinking sometimes, but it's positive. So it's that kind of creative thinking, which can be a little bit messy, but which really provides them with those strong foundations for becoming successful thinkers.
I think as well as things, when we're still sort of sticking to this theme of limiting choices, there's things we can do about how we set up children's environments at home that help them be able to make more choices about what they're going to do and what their play is going to be about. Again, just reflecting back on my journey, 20 years ago when I set up my nursery, the norm back then, and it's changed now, but the norm back then was that nurseries were very tidy places and that most of the resources were in boxes and the boxes were stored up high, and you'd sort of bring down the Lego, and this morning it was going to be Lego play or Duplo play or arts and crafts and so on. And when we went to look at exemplar of best practice, I went into a nursery and all of its resources were down on the child's level. And this is normal now, this is everyday practice. But back 20 years ago, it was really unusual. And I was asking the nursery owner, gosh, how do you deal with this? Don't the children just tip everything out? Don't they just make a complete mess everywhere? And she got me to reframe my thinking completely about why it was so important that instead of me as the adult in the space or the adult at home saying, right, now we're going to do Lego, giving children more choices. And we can create an environment like that at home, can't we?
You can. And again, my first 5 years in our app, we really stress the idea that everything you need is in your house somewhere or just outside your door. So you don't need to set up your house like a nursery. You absolutely don't. But what we're saying is, it's not Lego day and it's not Duplo day. It's whatever you can give the children in terms of them having a selection of things to be able to do. But also for parents, there is some bravery in adopting a positive thinking approach with children, because it's things like, you're going to get yourself some water, here's the cup, here's the jug, pour the water yourself. And more of the water is going to end up outside the cup than inside the cup. And sometimes as a parent, you have to fight all of those urges to say, stop, I'll just do it, or put a cloth down. But it is that idea that children are learning really important skills, and it doesn't take very long before they get to judge the weight of the jug, the tipping point of water, the volume of the cup. All of that is thinking. How far to tip it using the muscles of their body. Whereas if you just do it, you take away that opportunity.
Sorry.
We were even chatting before about an Instagram that we looked at. An Instagram live was somebody who'd given their child some orange segments in a bowl for a snack. And of course, the first thing the child had done was just tip them all out and then started to move them about and put some back in the bowl and some not in the bowl. And we were talking about the thinking that was involved in that, and that parents' urges often are to say, but you're eating food even though you're 2 and it should stay on the plate and you should show kind of good manners. And that idea that actually the child is just showing something that's typical to child development.
Yeah.
And we stop that development by imposing this kind of cultural belief here in the UK often around manners and how things should stay on a plate, where actually developmentally it's way more impactful if the things don't stay on the plate. Or you give your child their orange segments in lots of little pots of different sizes with a segment in each pot in the hope that they're going to tip them out and turn the pots over, or you hide them under the pot so they've got to lift up the pot to find which one's got a segment and which one hasn't. And then they'll push all of the orange segments into one pot to see how many they can get in. And it all becomes very juicy and orangey and messy and there's segments on the floor. And there's a balance as a parent, we get that, between what you've practically got time to do and what would be most developmentally appropriate. But giving children opportunities to show typical development and trying to step away a little bit from some of the kind of society kind of image that we have around what children should be doing helps them to develop that kind of thinking skill.
Yeah, I think sometimes the behaviour we expect of children can just be developmentally inappropriate for where they are. And I think we're, again, in the app trying to really help parents understand that and reframe the thinking, look differently at what they're seeing. Because at the end of the day, when we all go out for a meal as adults, we don't chuck our food onto the table and throw it around, or not typically anyway.
No, we don't. And also, in other cultures, they will eat with their hands all of the time. So it's about cultural expectations that sometimes get in the way of development. So one phrase I use way too often in my work is developmentally possible doesn't mean it's developmentally appropriate. So there are things we can get our children to do with coaching or reward or whatever it may be, but it doesn't mean to say that developmentally it's appropriate in terms of their development.
Yeah, and every time they're observing us eat, they're still observing, we're modelling where we want them to get to.
Yeah.
It's just that they'll get there when they're ready, and the fact that they're, playing with their food or chucking the food off the plate, it's just all very normal.
And thinking doesn't stop you from being hungry. So if a child is hungry to eat, they won't say, well, I'm just going to engage in some thinking process first and then eat my orange segments. And I think it's, about us as parents having that kind of view. If we reframe our thinking slightly and don't see it as like, oh, well, you stop tipping your snack out of the bowl, leave it in the bowl, and think of it as, well, that's really interesting because you're exploring some really exciting thinking processes there by tipping stuff out, filling stuff up, upside down, back to front, and think about it differently. It might ease some of the anxiety around why is my child doing that?
There was a lovely one that a parent shared with me, that they had a cupboard in the kitchen at home and that they dedicated to be their child's cupboard, and there were things in there that she knew were safe for a child to play with, and that child would happily toddle over to it, open it up and take out the things from their cupboard. So again, it's that practical way of setting up your home that's child friendly, learning friendly, thinking friendly, but it's still your home and you don't want to make it feel like a nursery.
And that's really interesting, because when children develop the concept of object permanence, so the fact that when they can't see it they know it's still there, the development of that, and that's even down to parents, so that's why you can never go and just sit on the loo for 2 minutes, please start somebody knocking on the door saying, Daddy, are you in there? But the idea of object permanence, that's why they love opening drawers and cupboards. Partly it's to do with the cause and effect, that when I pull this something happens and when I close it makes a bang, but it can also be linked to the fact that I know there's something in here even though I can't see it. And it may not be appropriate, or you may not have the opportunity to allow your children to have a cupboard or a drawer that they can open and close. But then even things like a cardboard box, where you cut one side out so there's a flap, just cut around 3 sides, not one, and have that as something that they're going to want to open and close, and have lots of things with flaps that they can open and close and put things in and get things out, might stop them a little bit doing the things around the kitchen cupboards. But what you don't want to do is say, oh, they keep opening the drawers and the doors all the time, it's getting on my wick, which it will, let's lock them all with child locks so they can't touch them, because then all they do is try to rattle the child lock.
Break the doors.
Yeah, keep them safe, but think, right, okay, let's give them other things that they can open and close, other things with flaps, because clearly they're showing a behaviour that wants to think and explore. Let's take them to a different focus that takes them away from the thing that's not safe or that gets in the way of what we're doing.
Another question here that's come through is, how can I support my child's thinking through play? So maybe just some little examples of things in the home that are really easy to do that help children think that little bit as they're doing it.
Well, we talked a lot about open-ended resources that children will want to explore, and again, part of our role as adults is to support them in that exploration, trying not to say, now do this, or look, daddy's done this, now you do it. But one of the ways you can really help them through play is like using thinking language. So the language of I wonder, or I wonder what would happen if, or how about, or what do you think, or I think this might happen, I wonder if I'm right. So again, when we talked about becoming a mathematician, about the idea that when you reframe a question, and rather than say what's the answer to a child, you say I think this is the answer, am I right? You take the pressure subconsciously off the child needing to be right, because you're taking that hit, but actually they're doing the same thinking process. So the idea of thinking language, the idea of creating situations where they are affirming what you are thinking and you're kind of modelling that. But there is thinking in everything they do, in every game they play. So they think about the real world and the processes that are involved in the real world, but they also think in terms of imaginative play. So when you're creating a castle that's got doors that you can't open, and when you've got dragons in the moat around the outside, and how they're thinking about how the baddie can't cross the moat because the dragons are going to eat him or burn him with fire, whatever it may be, all of that is about thinking, but that's not linked to where is my snack. That's linked to the thinking that goes on around imaginative development and weaving those things together, and both are equally as important.
You've just talked about the real world there, and this question, it kind of almost breaks my heart to ask this question, but one that came through was about a child that's hearing snippets of the news, and he's now really beginning to worry. They're hearing about wars, they're hearing about fighting, and that's become a big and regular sort of worry and concern for the child. Lots of questions being asked, lots of thinking going on that's maybe not quite so healthy. And I don't, I'm focusing this question more on children that are not living in the war situation right now. I cannot even begin to imagine what's going on in Ukraine and other countries around the world, but nonetheless an important question.
Yes, I think this is about children who overthink. So they hear snippets of things that they half understand or half comprehend or completely misunderstand, and therefore how they process that is not the same way that we would process that as adults. And that will happen at the moment because it's all over on the news. So one way that children process things that they don't quite understand is to replay them, so they're getting their thinking process straight. So you might find that if there's lots of news or images or language around fighting and war and things like that, the children are overhearing. Not necessarily, I'm not suggesting that the children are sitting watching the news, but they hear it. And adults are talking about this a lot, so you hear it in the street, you hear it in the shops. Sometimes you'll find that then becomes part of their play. So you'll get more play that's linked to that kind of superhero weapon exploration. But also, I think as parents, if we acknowledge our children are beginning to hear this or have heard it, it's not trying to ignore it or just say, oh, it's okay, everything's all right, because they need to resolve the thinking that's going on in their head. So it's partly about trying to ascertain what your child knows, so get them to tell you what they know or what they think, because if you launch in with a long explanation about the war, in Ukraine, then you might be giving them more information than they need. So find out what they know, try and talk about it in terms that they will understand. There's also a lot of reassurance that comes in there about how this is happening for children in this country. It's happening far away and it's not happening here, because children obviously haven't got a concept of geography or time or distance, so they need to believe that it's happening but know that they are safe. And also a big thing that you can do is focus on the good things that are happening, because they've heard about the bad stuff, but also how helpful people are being, how the whole world is, and really focus on those positive outcomes. So not saying don't give children information, because if they've heard a little bit, then you need to clarify it for them. You need to make them feel safe and secure, but also find some positives. And really, it's a lovely lesson for them that even in the most negative of circumstances, there are some positives that will come out of it.
I think we've wrote a blog actually to help parents with some of these difficult questions. So if you nip on the website, or in fact we'll just put it on the Insta bio so that it's easy to get access to. It's a really helpful resource given everything that's going on. Well, back to something more, it's hard to move on from that sometimes with everything that's going on in the world. But we'll move back into the core of what we're talking about today. So another question that's come through. How or should I correct my child if they get something wrong? So if the thinking that goes on ends up in an output that's not right, what do we do?
Well, it's a really complex question.
I know.
Making
you work for your money today.
There's no definitive answer, really. I think we would always say that in most instances you want to try and avoid letting a child know that they are wrong, because also you're thinking about, we are interpreting children's thinking through an adult brain. So things that make perfect sense to them because they follow a really obvious line of thinking when you're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old are not the same as when you are kind of older and adult. And there are ways of correcting children's thinking so that you're not just saying no. You can start to use again that language we've talked about, which is I wonder what, or how about, or can you tell me? So all of that kind of question and language helps them to expand their thinking a little bit more. Or if it's not a deal breaker, and it's not a huge misconception or misunderstanding, you let the moment pass. So let the child feel like they've explored, they've achieved, and then you think, okay, not right now, but I'm going to revisit that, and I'm going to set up a scenario where I can model the thinking, the outcome, we can small world play it, we can do it through story, we can talk about it. So it's not saying you would never ever correct your child, but you've got to remember as an adult, if somebody corrects you at work or wherever social situation you're in, even if it's like you're at Christmas over the dinner table, you're having a discussion and somebody basically calls you out and says you're wrong, you don't go, oh, thank you very much for that, I've reflected on that and that's great, thanks for improving me. You're literally like, right, I'm going to have you. So children are no different. The idea is we want to both boost their confidence, because confident children make confident learners. So it's not ignoring times when children are wrong. Sometimes it will be appropriate to say, this is how it is. And lots of time there'll be an opportunity to think, right, I don't need to correct you now because it's not going to make a difference, but I will go back and support that learning through another way later on, probably through play.
Another question that's come through is about intervening. When's the right time to do it, and how do I give my child time to think?
Well, again, it's a complex thing that we do because we can't see into our children's brains and see exactly how their brains are working, how their thinking process is going. So sometimes as parents we get it dead right and you think, oh, that was a magic moment, and sometimes you get it dead wrong and you think, right, I've just put literally 2 feet in that. I should have just kept my mouth shut and let things carry on as they were. That's the nature of being a realistic parent. But the idea, I think, is that you sometimes can intervene to support your child, but the best way to do it is through play and interaction. So again, as we've just been saying, not a case of saying it's black or white, but letting them think through that process. And the thing about time is really important because you need time to think. And children need time to think. Now, we've got really well-developed brains. We've got loads of creative thinking going on in our heads from all the experience we've had from being born to where we are now. If you've only been alive for 3 years, 2 years, even 5 years, you haven't got that huge bank. So you need time to be able to assimilate what you know and the new experience that's happening to you. So don't be afraid of thinking time. And don't let your children feel awkward about the pause. And you can even say, as an adult, oh gosh, I'm going to have some time to think about that, because that's a really positive modelling around, I need to take a moment, even if you don't. I need to let me just have 2 minutes to think about that. Okay, I've thought about it and this is what I think. So thinking time is a good thing, and letting children know that taking time to think is a positive is a really good thing, a skill for them to have even going forward into adulthood.
I think loads of thinking can go on with outdoor play and being in the playground and using play equipment in parks and so on. And that thing about intervening, especially when children are navigating new big pieces of equipment they've never used before, and giving them time to think about what can they do, what can they not do. I think it's so easy as a parent to stop them figuring that out because you're instantly trying to make sure they don't fall off or don't hurt themselves.
It's all done from a place of wanting your children to be safe, and we are going to do an Instagram live about risky play and taking risks, because there's some really interesting research about children who don't get a lot of opportunity to take risks when they're little are less equipped to take risks when they get older, and they're bigger risks. But we sometimes would do a thing where we talk about the Be Careful challenge, where you say, right, when you take your children to the playground or outside in the woods, wherever it may be, you cannot use the phrase be careful. We may well have talked about this before. And that idea that they need to experience the thinking process that is, am I too high? Am I unstable? Am I wobbly? Am I feeling like I can do this? Have I got that knot in the pit of my stomach? What am I going to do if I fall? What am I going to do if I jump? All of those thinking processes are linked to risk, but they're really important. So again, and we'll talk about it more on our Risky Play live, but the idea of finding alternatives to say other than be careful all the time, which is, it's innate in you because you want your children to be safe, but finding other things to say that empower them rather than stop them from doing what you want them to do.
I thought we could finish by just thinking of an example each of our favourite types of activities that really foster thinking. And I know what mine is because we used to do it every weekend, which was that during the course of the week, anything that we would typically throw away or recycle that was useful for sort of crafty stuff, we'd leave in a box. And there'd be things like egg boxes, kitchen rolls, toilet rolls, boxes, all sorts of things by the end of the week. In fact, we were quite selective about what we've kept because obviously you'd just end up with the rubbish bins with otherwise. But on a Saturday, we'd quite often just tip the box onto the floor and we'd put some scissors out and some colouring pens out and some glue out, and literally just to leave Olivia to sort of figure it out and join it together and have a play with all these resources. And there's a couple of myths worth busting here as well. There used to be the thought that you couldn't use egg boxes because it would give a child salmonella, and you can't use toilet rolls because they're unhygienic as well. But the health and safety executive in the UK, you probably have similar things throughout the world, but actually put up some research that said that egg boxes and toilet rolls are absolutely fine for children to play with, and they're a brilliant resource. But Olivia just used to love that. Yeah. Olivia's 11 now, we don't still do it anymore, but just such an easy activity to do in the home. It costs nothing, and it still ends up ultimately in the recycle bin, but it has that extra level of value just beforehand. She loved it.
Open-ended and exploratory. I remember once working with a nursery and chatting before we did our session, and they had the microwave going constantly, and I said, what are you doing? And they said, we have to microwave our toilet rolls for 30 seconds on high before we can use them. And again, it's these myths that occur. I think I'm going to go for something completely different, which I might have mentioned before, which is we used to do with our boys all the time when they were little, because bath time, bedtime are really good thinking and reflecting time, because one of the great things about reinforcing positive thinking is opportunities to reflect on that process. So we used to do best bits of the day when they were little, and as they got older we used to do worst bits and best bits. Now worst bits was interesting because that's when you got to explore some worries, but also give you a real insight into how your children were and what they were enjoying doing. And best bit of the day was what they'd enjoyed and why. So I think it was lovely in terms of socially sharing as a family, but also just being able to explore what they were thinking about, and also a lovely time to model some thinking strategies, even around emotions, by saying it's okay to feel like that, it's okay to think that, I think this. So I used to love best bits and worst bits, and I felt it was a lovely end to the day, but also a really lovely opportunity to connect with your children.
I think that's just such a lovely open question as well, because parents, and I used to do this myself sometimes, could say, did you have a good day today at school? And then you're just going to get a yeah.
Or a no, or I don't know. Yeah.
And there's no conversation, and there's no reopening that conversation. Whereas if we ask, what was your best bit today at school, you're much more likely to get a response.
And also when children come home from school or nursery, their brains are literally fried because they've been full on interacting, doing. So probably the worst question you can ever ask anybody, and I still do it to when my youngest son came home from college the other day, and I was like, "How was your day?" And he was like, "Well, how do you think it was?" It's that idea that when you say to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, like, "What did you do today?" And they're like, "I can't remember, and I'm shattered, and I just don't want to think about it now." So actually, as parents, as long as they're smiling when they come out of the door, wait until bath time, a couple of hours later, you're likely to get way more about their day than you are saying, kind of, "How was your day today?" Or go down that line of saying, "Tell me something brilliant you did today," or "Tell me what your best bit was."
Well, I think, again, the time has flown by.
Blimey.
So we'll wrap it up for today. But next week, we're going to tackle another topic that parents love to talk about, which is becoming resilient.
Yes.
And that's going to be Tuesday the 15th at noon. We do have the usual PDF that you can download. So we've done a PDF today for becoming a thinker. And it's a great resource. And if you're a parent, we hope you love reading it. And if you're dialing in from a nursery, you are more than welcome to share that PDF with your parents, because we want this the news to go far and wide, that there's different ways to think about things, and we hope we're encouraging you and your parents to think that little bit differently.
And of course, if you haven't already downloaded our app, who even are you? But it's on the App Store, on Google Play soon, and it's free for 14 days, so you can really get in there, have a look at all of the features, have a look at the links, read some of the further reading, really get to understand what My First 5 Years is all about. And then it's $1.99 for the first 3 months thereafter.
And now we have to get up and turn it off because it's
I've
miles
just realised,
away.
we've now got a desk, which means we can't just reach over and touch. So I'm going to do a...
Are you going to shimmy away and turn it off?
You smile and say goodbye to the lovely people, and I'll just subtly sashay over here and turn it off. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you so much. We really love doing these, and we hope you love them too.